This is Ed Driscoll for PJmedia.com, and we're talking with Jonathan Last of the Weekly Standard and the author of the new book, What to Expect When No One's Expecting, America's Coming Demographic Disaster. It's published by Encounter Books and available from Amazon.com and your local bookseller. And Jonathan, thanks for stopping by today.
It is a pleasure.
Jonathan, what initially made you decide to write a book on demographics?
You know, it's sort of a funny but ultimately kind of boring story. About 6 or 7 years ago, I was reading a bunch of books, and I read 3 in a row that all mentioned demographics. And I'm a big endnotes nerd. I like looking at endnotes. And as I was going through them, they all referred to the same book. It was this book called The Empty Cradle by a guy named Phil Longman. And I went and I read Longman's book, and it was just gobsmackingly awesome. Phil is a total liberal progressive Democrat. He works for the New America Foundation in Washington. He is intellectually fearless and unbelievably honest and smart. And anyway, I called Phil up and I said, you know, I'm not a stalker, but I work at the Weekly Standard a few blocks away. Can I buy you lunch? And he said, sure. And when we met, he was the biggest sweetheart in the world. I told him I was interested in this stuff. He started pointing me in different directions for reading and research. And I just started tumbling down the rabbit hole. So it's all Phil's fault. I blame him for it.
Well, beyond Phil Longman's efforts, how did you research the book? If you're writing a book on demographics, where do you go for statistics on these sorts of numbers?
Well, you know, it turns out there is an enormous amount of research that's done on this stuff, and by some really wonderful people. That was really the nicest thing that happened to me in the course of spending the last 3 years writing this book, is that I got to know a whole bunch of really smart academics, people at the Census Bureau, people at the UN Population Division, people in different think tanks and different universities, you know, both here and over in Europe. And they're great people, and they're doing really interesting research. And the problem with it is it's very math-heavy, and the stuff they publish is, I would say, to a lot of people, kind of unreadable. And to me, I have a little bit of a math background. I was a science major as an undergraduate. I got as high as differential equations before I had to tap out and say, I can't take any more. So I can read this stuff, and I enjoy reading it. And my book is it just stands on the shoulders of all the research that's been done. And one of the things I found was really interesting as I researched all this is that most professional and academic demographers are liberal. There are a few conservatives out there, but they're mostly quite liberal. But there's total agreement between the left and the right among the people who actually study this stuff and do the research. They all think the same thing. They all believe that we're headed in this very bad direction. They all think that this is like the story of the last 40 years. And it's funny that only like among the lay left, like the people who write for the New York Times or who blog for Slate, that's where the disagreement exists. It's not among like the professional left, the professional liberals who actually follow the subject. I would say there's remarkably little actual controversy in the world of demographics. And what there is instead a lot of people doing really interesting research, nibbling at the corners and trying to untie, little pieces of the puzzle here and there.
Jonathan, I watched your CBS Morning News segment, and I must say they treated you surprisingly fairly given that it's CBS. But the anchorwoman asked the question that you must be getting all the time from left liberal interviewers. Why should I care about your book when for 40 years I've been hit over the head by the media that overpopulation was almost as big a concern as, say, global warming? Yeah,
and I say this to people. I say, it's one of these weird situations where everything we think we know is wrong, and it's all wrong because of one guy, Paul Ehrlich. Paul Ehrlich is not a professional demographer. He only plays one on TV, and he wrote what I think of as the most spectacularly wrong book ever written. He was wrong in the particulars. He said that within a couple of years, hundreds of millions of people were going to starve to death, and that nothing could be done to stop this. He said the population growth was going to increase asymptotically to the moon. That neither of these things happened. But more to the point, he was wrong at the moment when the exact opposite thing was happening. He published his book in 1968. In 1968, the fertility rates across the Western countries fell off of the table and went into steep, prolonged, sustained decline which they are still experiencing today. So he was exactly wrong. And what's funny, and also slightly frustrating, but funny, is that again in the world of professional demographers, like the people who do this for a living, the people who are tenured professors and who work at the United Nations, they all, since for the last 35, 40 years, have basically ignored Ehrlich and view him as sort of a crank, and they've been actually focusing the bulk of their research on exactly the opposite question. where has the global fertility decline come from? And that's the big question that I tackle, and I sort of focus on America because we live here. I'm interested in it. But I would say, again, and these people who are liberal, they would vote for whatever the liberal party is in their country. They all love Barack Obama, but they all view Paul Ehrlich as a crank too. It's just that his book, I think, really touched a spot with the sort of deeply anti-humanist strain of the environmental movement. You scratch a lot of environmentalists deep enough, and eventually you'll get them to say that people are a cancer, and that we must protect Mother Gaia. And at the end of the day, everybody's got to believe something. They don't believe in God, so they believe in that stuff, and I say more power to them. But it's not really based on data or research or science; it's just theology.
Now, our current period of demographic decline isn't the first time that America has had a birth dearth. What caused them in the past?
Well, we've been heading downward ever since the founding. The total fertility rate, that's the number of children born to the average woman. It's about 7 around the time of the 1800 census. And it was gradually declining from there clear on through the Great Depression. The Great Depression helped push it down a little bit. And we've only had one major moment of increase, and that was the baby boom. And for about 20 years, we had significantly elevated fertility. And then by 1968, it slumped back down and fell off the table. Now, it's funny. In America, we think that we're okay because our fertility rate is about 1.9 right now. And 1.9 is not bad at all. If we could sustain 1.9, then I wouldn't have written the book, and I would have thought that everything is fine. But I think that's really misleading. And it's misleading because that 1.9 is really a mathematical construct created by the immigration we've received over the last 30 years. We've had 38 million immigrants in the last 30 years. That's the biggest sustained wave of immigration in our country's history. And when you strip those numbers out, you strip out the actual warm bodies and you strip out the elevated fertility rate that they bring with them, America looks like Europe. We look exactly like Europe in terms of our demographics. And that's a much sterner, scarier proposition. Now, again, I say if you strip them out, we look like Europe, and this worries me, because a lot of demographers believe that we may not continue to receive this wave of immigration. Whatever we think about it here, whether you think we should have a fence or amnesty or a DREAM Act or whatever, those are all demand side. There's a supply side issue to it as well, and the supply side is countries with sub-replacement fertility historically do not send immigrants out into the world. And all the fertility rates in Central and South America are headed south on an express elevator. Many of those countries are already below the replacement rate, and none of the countries in Central and South America below the replacement rate send us any significant amount of immigrants.
Today, though, in addition to our flatlined economy, there are societal pressures that are causing many adults to choose not to have kids. Could you talk a bit about those?
Yeah, and this is one of those interesting things that I found. We hear a lot about this, right, about non-traditional families and how people's mores are changing and the patriarchal structures no longer hold sway over us. You've heard this before, I'm sure. But the data show some very interesting things. So marriage is generally on the decline in America, but 90% of Americans get married at some point. That's a lot. It's low historically for our nation, but it's still 9 out of 10. Now, whether or not these marriages last, I don't think a lot of people get married hoping they're going to get divorced. It suggests that they would like to be married. And then you look at what's called ideal fertility. Demographers measure this. They talk, you ask people at various points in their life what they think the ideal number of children to have is. And this is a remarkably interesting finding, and it surprised the heck out of me. The first thing that's surprising about it is that men and women have very similar ideal numbers. I would not have expected that. I suspected one sex would be higher or lower than the other. They're not. The other thing is that people's idea of the ideal changes over time. When you're 20, you have a lower ideal number than you do when you're 35. And so people shift that number a little bit higher as they get older. But the final thing that was surprising is that our ideal is 2.5, and it has been 2.5 for 40 years. It's been remarkably stable. People still want families. The real thing that's happening is, with a fertility rate of 1.9, we're just not achieving them. Now, I actually think that's sort of hopeful because it suggests that, there's this divide here between what people would like to do and what they feel they can do and what they eventually achieve. And if you can find a way to bridge that divide and sort of help people achieve the families they want, then there's room to be so hopeful. My book does not in any way argue for people who don't want children to have children. I have 3 kids. I am totally unromantic and unsentimental about it. And I say to people who don't want kids, God bless you, raise a glass and pour one for me tonight. On the other hand, those people, not to deny the validity of their experiences, but they are not the median experience in America. People still do want kids.
Yeah, and one of the things that's fascinating about your book is that it's got some surprisingly tough love for those parents who choose to have kids.
Yeah, well, I'm sort of an unsentimental guy, period. But yeah, I mean, there's no papering over it. And as a parent, I would say when I'm in line at the grocery store and somebody comes up to me as my 3 kids are crying and says, "Oh, treasure these moments. They go by so fast." I think to myself, really? Yeah, this is sterling, And I would say, so nothing bothers me more than mawkish sentimentality about parenthood and children. And look, there are lots of parents who really do love parenthood and who have a wonderful experience with their children. And that's great. I applaud them. But again, my book it's very data-driven. I always go to the data. And there's a lot of research on what we'll call by shorthand parental happiness. And it suggests that if you have 2 people who are similar in every demographic marker, they're the same religion, the same race, the same income, they live in the same place, the only difference between them is that one of them is a parent and one of them is not a parent. The non-parent is going to be about 6 percentage points happier than the parent. You lose about 6 percentage points of happiness when you have a kid, and then you lose another 2 points for each additional kid. So I guess the good news is there's an economy of scale, but the bad news is that you're still less happy when you have kids. And, I think that's just sort of important to acknowledge that people aren't crazy. They're not entirely irrational as they, back away from having kids.
In America alone, Mark Stein warned that the Muslim world was going to win the demographic war against the West. But as you write in What to Expect When No One's Expecting, several Middle Eastern nations are having demographic crises of their own.
Mark's book is great. God, I loved that book when I read it, and I still love it today. And he's not wrong. So Mark's point was that it's a game of last man standing, and there's a lot of truth to that. And he's right in this respect, that the Muslim countries tend to be tailing everybody else in their fertility decline, but they're declining too. I think there is sort of, the common perception that, over in Iran, they're just breeding like crazy. And they're not. Actually, Iran has a lower fertility rate than we do right now. And when you look at the slopes of those curves, you look at the DXDT, many of the Muslim countries, although they began their fertility decrease at much later dates, their rate of fertility decreases are much faster than we're experiencing in the West. Now, there are some places which are exceptions. Nigeria, the Muslim population in Nigeria, has shown no decrease in overall fertility. And in the West Bank, actually in the Palestinian territories, their fertility rates have remained incredibly high without showing any signs of decreasing. But in general, the Muslim world is going to suffer from the same consequences we are. The big difference, though, is that many of those countries are not rich. And it is one thing to get old and decline in terms of your population when you are a wealthy first world country. It is quite another to do so when you are not.
Jonathan, getting back to demographics in the United States, Glenn Reynolds of Instapundit.com has 2 books out from, I believe, the same publisher as What to Expect When No One's Expecting, which explore the higher education bubble and the K-12 implosion. How does the skyrocketing cost of education impact American demographics, or perhaps vice versa?
Well, it impacts it in 3 ways. There's a front end and a back end, and then there's a straight-up timeline, chronology end. So on the back end, people who graduate from college graduate with a lot of debt. They say in surveys that debt, you ask them, they tell you that debt is making them hold off on getting married and making them hold off on having children. Going forward, prospectively, if you were today to have a kid and think about what it would be like to put that kid in college today, that is the equivalent of buying basically a house and a half. Average cost of a house in America is $185,000. Average cost of college tuition right now is something like $212,000 or something like that. The real cost of college since 1965, the real cost, this is accounting for inflation, has increased by 1,000%. If this was any other sector, and then Glenn makes this point, any other sector, we would be saying, this is broken, this needs to be reformed. But because it's education, we just keep pushing people into it. So those are the front end and the back end effects. But the other effect, is the chronological one, is that it just keeps pushing back the average time of family formation. So you don't graduate until you're 22 or, maybe 23 or 24, and that's just with undergraduate. So now you don't even begin to think about family formation, and you don't get married until, say, 27, which is, I think, about what our average age of first marriage is now. a dramatic rise since the early 1970s. You then look at time of first birth. Most people, try at least to not have that first birth until after they're married, and that gets pushed back until you're now in your late 28, early 29s. And then you run up into the wall of biology. After 35, it becomes harder for women to get pregnant. After 39, it becomes really, really hard for women to get pregnant. And so you can see why, somebody who wants to have, 2 or 3 kids, if they're not getting started till they're 29 or 30, all of a sudden that becomes, just as a logistical matter, kind of tough.
Jonathan, last question, because I know you're on the Whirlwind Tour today to promote the book. Do you think that Obama, or anybody in D.C. for that matter, is taking the issue of America's demographic decline seriously?
Well, Obama sure is. And, in a funny way, actually, Rick Santorum, he didn't talk about this explicitly during the campaign, but he alluded to it a lot. And he sort of tied it into sort of, talking morally about capitalism and the free market and the middle class in a very populist way. I actually thought that was kind of interesting and effective. He was the only one selling that sort of thing in the Republican field. Now, of course, I would say this because I'm a crazy person and I'm obsessed with demographics, but I actually do think that there is a really elegant and interesting way for Republicans to create a populist case for supporting middle-class families, centered around the idea of not hectoring people into having babies, but trying to take policy changes that will help people have the families that they want to have. And I think there's a way for Republicans to do it. I think Rick Santorum was sort of edging in that direction. And I'll be surprised if somebody in the 2016 field doesn't decide to take a flyer with this.
This is Ed Driscoll for PJmedia.com, and we've been talking with Jonathan Last of the Weekly Standard, the author of the new book, What to Expect When No One's Expecting, America's Coming Demographic Disaster. It's published by Encounter Books and available from Amazon.com and your local bookseller. And Jonathan, thank you once again for stopping by today.
It was great to be with you. Thanks, Ed.